A treatise on the four wills in Christ. You ask about the will of God and the will of man similarly. Christ was God, and therefore the divine will was in him. And because he was also man, similarly the human will was in him. I do not mean the human will made by man's fault and vice, but the will required by human nature. Therefore, in Christ, the divine will existed insofar as Christ was God, and similarly, the human will existed in him insofar as he was a man. The human will, however, is considered in three ways: according to reason, according to piety, and according to the flesh. Therefore, in Christ, there was the will of divinity, the will of reason, the will of piety, and the will of the flesh. The will of divinity dictata, the sentence through justice; the will of reason approved the truth through obedience; the will of piety sighed with compassion over the misfortune of others; the will of the flesh murmured due to suffering in one's own misfortune. See if all these were not present in Christ. That leper who begged for healing and confessed his majesty acknowledged the power of the divine will, saying, "Lord, if you are willing, you can make me clean." And the Lord, to show both the judgment and power of the same divine will, said, "I am willing, be clean." This is an example of the divine will in Christ. Regarding the will of reason, which was subject to the divine will through obedience, he said, "The spirit is indeed willing." Regarding the will of the flesh, which resisted the terrible suffering due to weakness, he said, "The flesh is weak." The spirit was willing through the will of reason, following the disposition of the divine will and the suffering of his flesh. The flesh, however, was weak, resisting suffering through natural providence, which had taught it to hate its own misfortune. Therefore, according to the will of divinity in the preceding disposition, and according to the will of reason approving and following the divine disposition, Christ willed to suffer. However, according to the will of the flesh, according to which naturally, as a man, he did not hate his own flesh, he did not will to suffer. Yet in this, he was not contrary to the divine will, because even this, that he did not will, was according to the divine will. There was still another will in Christ, the will of piety or humanity. For piety itself is called humanity, and those who are pious are called humane, and they easily empathize with the miseries of others. It is proper to humanity to feel compassion and to be moved by piety in the misery of others. A beast can suffer, but to feel compassion is a property of humanity. Therefore, the will of piety is called the will of humanity, because it is human to be moved by piety. And this was similarly found in Christ according to the nature of humanity. When he approached Jerusalem and saw the city, he wept over it. Why did he weep if he did not feel sorrow? Therefore he did not will what he grieved. What did he grieve? Their destruction? If he grieved over their destruction, he did not will their destruction. How did he not will it? According to the divine will, of course, he willed what was just to come. According to the will of reason, he agreed with justice and approved justice. But according to the will of piety, without hatred of justice, he grieved over their misery. Just as according to the will of the flesh, he did not accuse justice but rejected punishment. Each will operated what was its own, and followed what pertained to itself. The divine will sought justice, the rational will obedience, the human will mercy, the will of the flesh nature. Nor was one contrary to another, but each sought what was its own, so that although it willed one thing, it was not contrary to another's will. Just as it was natural for divinity not to abandon justice, so it was just for the flesh to preserve nature, and for piety, not to love another's misery. Thus, in Christ, there was the will of divinity, dictating justice, the will of reason, approving justice, Tisha approving, the will of humanity, through which he wished harm to no one, the will of the flesh, through which he did not want suffering for himself. It was just for the flesh not to want its own suffering, because this was according to nature, and it was just for God to want his suffering, because this was according to justice. For the flesh did not refuse because God willed it, just as God did not refuse because the flesh willed it. Similarly, the piety that mercifully refused suffering or the destruction of the miserable according to the feeling of compassion, did not refuse against God justly willing it, but it loved mercy as its own, and yet did not disapprove justice, which was not its own. Indeed, it must be understood that the fear of suffering torments mortal flesh, and piety is emotionally moved by the love of compassion. Only in this present life, where compassion is due to the wicked as long as they can be corrected, and suffering is not removed from the good as long as they can become better. However, when this mortal body puts on immortality, and this corruptible body puts on incorruption, then certainly, just as the flesh will no longer be afflicted by suffering or the fear of suffering, so the mind will no longer suffer any pain from the compassion for another's pain. There, indeed, the flesh will have security against suffering, and the soul will have purity and piety. The security of the flesh will come from being unable to suffer, the purity of the mind from truth. Understand what I say? To suffer and to feel compassion are both pains. Suffering is given to man for iniquity, feeling compassion is commanded for goodness. For it is just and fair before God, that he who suffers should also feel compassion, so that iniquity may be erased by suffering, and goodness exercised by compassion. Indeed, this pertains to the goodness of mortal life, that it accommodates itself to its condition in others, and becomes a sharer in another's suffering through compassion, so that just as what suffers is of necessity, so what feels compassion is a work of goodness. Where there will be no suffering, there will be no compassion. However, it will not be because there will be cruelty in another's punishment, but because there will be no torment from another's misery. Here, to feel compassion is a virtue. There, not to feel compassion is happiness. Here, you feel compassion willingly, moved by piety, grieved by goodness. There, you do not feel compassion through happiness, you are not moved by eternity, you are not grieved by being unable to suffer. Thus, to feel compassion can only exist where suffering can exist, for feeling compassion itself is suffering. Indeed, those who do not discard suffering there do not discard feeling compassion, because just as they suffer corruptibly for their iniquity, so they feel compassion carnally for another's unhappiness according to the affection of mortal life. Hence it is that the rich man in torment was concerned for his brothers, so that the misery would increase for him, because another's misery would also torture him in his own suffering. However, Abraham even saw the torment, and yet steadfast in the certainty of happiness, according to the Gospel of Luke chapter 16, rejected him with justice, saying, "Son, you have received good in your lifetime, and likewise Lazarus received bad." Hence also the psalmist, foreseeing how in that joy of eternity the hearts of the righteous, immutably clinging to divine justice through the love of truth, will not be able to desire or approve anything else except what they know to be according to it, says, "I will enter into the power of the Lord. Lord, I will remember only your justice." In this life, however, where we can neither perfectly know nor foresee the judgment of the same divine justice, we can also wish for some things that are not just according to it without injustice, because it pertains to us alone that where we do not know what pleases God more, we should choose what most agrees with piety. But where the judgment of divine justice is immutably fixed and shown, there is no place for piety against it. For if anything touches us there out of compassion, it is either from a vice with the dominant affection, or from the weakness of corruptible nature unable to resist suffering. For there are three kinds of compassion. There is, indeed, compassion, one from vice, another from nature, another from virtue. Virtue compassion is a vice when emotions are touched by reprehensible sorrow, where previously they were held by illicit love. Compassion is natural when the mind, from an inherent sense of pity, feels sorrow for the troubles of others whenever it sees nature oppressed or afflicted against the measure of pity or humanity. Compassion is virtuous when we empathize with others, pain for God's sake, particularly when we see justice being oppressed or innocence being afflicted. Compassion from vice is blameworthy. Compassion from nature is blameless. Compassion from virtue is praiseworthy. The first is condemned, the third is praised. The second, being natural, holds no fault, but also no reward, as it is not virtuous. In this life, as long as the mortal flesh can be harmed by suffering, the mutable soul can also be touched by compassion. However, where both will be truly impassible, there will be neither suffering in the flesh nor compassion in the mind. Currently, both use their mutability well if the flesh does not abandon patience in suffering, and the mind does not exceed the measure of justice in compassion. If you seek the time for compassion, as long as we can suffer, we should empathize. If you seek the place, compassion should be shown where the mercy of suffering is not yet to be despaired of. David wept when his son was sick but washed his face when he died. Samuel chapter 12 shows that the misery of compassion should be borne as long as the mercy of suffering is not to be despaired of. There is, however, a certain affection of compassion that follows even fallen nature with pity, according to which we are angry at the fault of our kind that cannot be corrected, just as we pity nature that cannot be extinguished. Now, mortal life subject to change temporarily endures part of the misery, but afterward, transferred to incorruption, it will lay it down. Now both are weak, with suffering in the flesh and compassion in the mind, but then both will be healed, confirmed against suffering through the immortality of the flesh, and against compassion through the immutability of the mind. For just as the sickness of the flesh is to suffer, so the sickness of the mind is to empathize. Therefore, God became man, who came to remove both, and endured both. He took on suffering in the flesh, he took on compassion in the mind. He wished to be weak in both for our sake, to heal us who are weak in both. He was weakened by suffering in his own punishment. He was weakened by compassion in the misery of others. He endured suffering to the point of dying for the dying. He took on compassion to the point of weeping for the perishing. Because of suffering, he gave his flesh to suffering. Because of mercy, he troubled his soul with compassion. In his flesh, he suffered for us by enduring pain. In his mind, he suffered with us by empathizing. And just as the weakness of the flesh in him, according to the natural affection, did not want his punishment, so the pity of the mind, according to the affection of mercy, did not want the misery of others. Just as he asked for the cup of suffering to be taken away according to the will of the flesh, which he knew would not be taken away, So he prayed for the sentence of condemnation to be mitigated for others according to pity, which he foresaw would unchangeably happen. Pity worked what was its own by showing mercy, and reason followed what was its own by obeying the divine plan. Therefore, there was no contradiction. If Christ, as a man, according to the affection of pity which he had assumed in his humanity, wanted something which, according to the divine will in which he arranged everything with the Father, he knew would not happen, this belonged to true humanity, to be moved by pity, and to true divinity, not to be moved from his plan. Thus in both respects he did what was proper. He was not contrary to himself, if, according to the pity appropriate to humanity, he wanted what, according to the justice due to divinity, he did not want, because he willed both to want this and not to want that. It is written, Jesus however groaned in spirit and troubled himself. Pay attention to this. He troubled himself. How did he trouble himself? What was the disturbance that caused Jesus to trouble himself? It was his own compassion and mercy that caused the disturbance. It was a good disturbance as he was moved by compassion. He troubled himself? Compassion troubled him, and he troubled himself as he willingly accepted compassion. Just as he gave himself up when Judas betrayed him, he troubled himself when compassion troubled him. This is well known and proven by frequent use. It is said to a person when they suffer, "You troubled yourself, you caused this harm to yourself." In the same way, Jesus troubled himself when compassion, which he willingly accepted, troubled him, and he gave himself up when the one to whom he had granted the power to betray him did so. Thus, Jesus, in his assumed humanity, as long as he wanted to bear it in its passible state, bore the properties of humanity, suffering in the flesh and compassion in the mind. However, in the state that he has now been transformed into, he can neither suffer corruption nor be troubled by compassion. For we know Christ as both suffering and compassionate according to his humanity. He said, "My days vanish like smoke, and my bones burn like glowing embers." The days vanished because of suffering. The bones burned because of compassion. The flesh died because of suffering. The soul dried up because of compassion. The pain of compassion was like a frying of the soul, burning with mercy, pressed by compassion, dried up by despair. I say despair not for himself, but for those who could neither be corrected in their evil, nor freed from it. In all this, we know Christ according to the flesh when he bore true humanity, and in true humanity bore true mortality. But now, we no longer know him according to the flesh since, having risen from the dead, he will die no more. Death no longer has dominion over him. For what he lives to God.